Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director of International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation in Washington, D.C. According to the International Energy Agency, over the past 5 years, the market for minerals that help power electric vehicles, solar turbines, wind turbines, and solar panels, as well as other technologies key to a clean energy transition, has doubled in size. Far from being independent of the physical world around us, we've never been more reliant upon it. New resources are needed to produce computers, cell phones, build homes and offices, and to make electric vehicles. Not only do we need concrete, steel, oil, and copper, we also need lithium, cobalt, nickel, and platinum, among others. In December 2021, the Asia Foundation held a trilateral dialogue virtually to look at areas where South Korea, Australia, and the United States could cooperate. The discussion touched on a wide variety of issues: security and military cooperation, cooperation in economics and trade, technological cooperation, as well as cooperation in the areas of energy and critical minerals. We thought that the issues of energy, critical materials, and supply chains warranted greater attention. With support from the Australia-Korea Foundation and Friends of the Asia Foundation in Korea, the Asia Foundation's Korea Country Office and the International Relations Program partnered with the Perth US-Asia Center at the University of Western Australia to organize a workshop in Seoul in early June, which brought together specialists from South Korea, Australia, and the United States, representing industry, academia, and the think tank community to discuss these issues. Key discussion points included strategies to secure future energy resources, including batteries, collaborative efforts to support the development and supply of critical materials such as lithium and hydrogen, and the challenges and risks of supply chain disruptions. The two-day discussion produced a report which we're proud to release today, titled What a Clean Energy Future Demands: A Massive Shift in Critical Materials and Global Supply Chains, which includes recommendations on how trilateral cooperation can help build scalable, sustainable, and secure supply chains needed to tackle one of today's most significant global challenges. If you go to the chat box, there will be a link to the report which you can download. Today, we have three people who participated in our workshop in Seoul, one each from South Korea, Australia, and the United States. From Australia, we have Mr. Gordon Flake. He's the founding and chief executive officer of the Perth US-Asia Center at the University of Western Australia. From the United States, we have Dr. Adam Simon, who is the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Michigan. And from South Korea, we have Dr. Kyungjin Song, who is the Executive Director of the Innovative Economy Forum. I've asked each of our speakers to speak for approximately 12 minutes. After they have spoken, we will open up the virtual floor for discussion. If you have a question, I would appreciate you putting it into our question box, not the chat box, as we won't be looking there. I would also appreciate if you would kindly identify yourselves when posing your questions, your name and your institutional affiliation. So now let's turn to our speakers. Gordon, can you talk about strategies for future energy and how Australia, South Korea, and the United States might cooperate in this regard? You're on mute, Gordon.
There we go. I certainly can. And let me start by saying how much of a pleasure it has been for the Perth US-Asia Center to work with the various parts of the Asia Foundation on this project. One thing that John didn't mention is this is actually a natural outgrowth of something we did last year, still during the midst of COVID, where we did a virtual meeting. And one of the clear things that came out of that report was that there was some potential for cooperation in this sector in particular. So it was wonderful to meet together with Adam and Kyungjin and others in Seoul in June, as well as a really strong Australian delegation, Korean delegation, US delegation to kind of think through these issues. So hats off to you, John, and to your team at the Asia Foundation for this report. It's focused and pithy, and I think it holds some clear lessons for each of the three countries involved here. If I start with that broad question you asked, Geographically, Australia, Korea, and the US are, we form a massive triangle, but we're not next door neighbors. And yet there's some remarkable synergies in this sector. Australia is a natural resource economy. I'm coming to you from Perth, Western Australia. And I should have noted, for those of you who heard me introduced as an Aussie, I'm an Australian citizen. I've been here 10 years from now, but you're not going to get a broad ochre Aussie accent out of me. My apologies. Too much Arizona stuck in there for the period of time. But Western Australia really is the economic engine of Australia. It's the world's largest natural resource province. Iron ore, LNG particular, long before that gold. And Australia as a country has long been known as kind of the lucky country. Small population, big land, and early on benefited from demand for natural products, back to the United Kingdom early on in agriculture, early gold rush in the 1850s, and then post-World War II, iron ore, now LNG. And everybody here for the last 5 or 6 years now has been focused on the next big wave in our great unbroken string of luck. And that really is in energy transition, future energy. Why? Because we just have world-leading resources of lithium, world-leading resources of rare earths in particular. Obviously, the other major building blocks in terms of your core metals in a serious way, and an industry that is world-class in its capabilities to do that. And so what you have between these three countries is quite interesting. It's a real complementarity, probably more than a complementarity. It's probably a synergy in that, the United States obviously has some resources of its own. But obviously with a population 13 times larger than that of Australia, a lot more difficulty with NIMBY, not in my backyard issues, for processing mining. Yet the United States obviously has core requirements for its manufacturing sector, particularly in the defense sector. So that's where the rare earths in particular come into play. But also the United States is leading on energy transition. And I'm going to come back to the Inflation Reduction Act in a little bit. Korea, on the other hand, is in every way, shape, and form a manufacturing superpower. And so whether it's current technology or future technology, there's this incredible demand for the natural resources that we have here that go into to the products that Korea produces today. So, probably half the people in the audience will have a Samsung. The rest of them will bought into some type of Apple cult, which I could never quite understand, different religion. But anyway, whether you're Apple or Samsung, right, you're going to probably have between 13 and 20 critical materials or rare earths in particular inside your cell phones, right? And Korea really has emerged as one of the global leaders, not just in telecommunication, but obviously in automobiles and increasingly in energy going forward. And so, Korea needs the natural resources Australia has. Australia has the capabilities to get them out. The United States has a little bit of both. And so there is this remarkable synergy. And so I think one of the things that really came out of our discussion in Seoul and is quite clearly laid out in this report is where there is that complementarity and where the three countries should be working together. Let me note a couple of things here. When I moved to Australia about 10 years ago, at that time, Western Australia was almost entirely focused on just a very small basket of commodities, iron ore, and then increasingly LNG, and it was all about China. Prior to that had been Japan. And Korea was kind of ancillary in terms of how Australia viewed the world. The United States was a major source of investment, and it's where all the Aussie entrepreneurs go to make it big, both in Hollywood and in the tech sector. So Aussies have long figured out it's a lot easier to get capital and to take your big ideas to the big smoke, to the United States. So the U.S.-Australia economic relationship is the most robust economic relationship Australia has, despite the fact that Perth is the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, D.C. If you really want to understand that, you have to understand that while, of course, like almost every other country in the world, China is Australia's largest trade partner. But when you factor in investment and you factor in things that don't exist in the Chinese market, we did a study back in 2015 where we looked at sales by American-owned firms, majority-owned firms in Australia, and sales by Australian majority-owned firms in the United States. And their numbers were 4 times and 5 times larger than the respective exports from those two countries, right? Just gives you a very different sense of how economically intertwined those two economies were. So really, really important. Korea has become a real star in the last 5 years. We did a report in 2017 where we were looking at rates of investment in Australian investment in Korea, Korean investment in Australia, and comparing sector by sector, company by company, prorating it against Japan for size of economy, looking at it as a percentage of outgoing foreign direct investment. We came to the conclusion that back in 2017, Korean investment in Australia was about 25% of what you would expect it to be. And part of the reason is Australia wasn't asking and Korea wasn't looking. That is not the case today. 2 things have happened. Number one, Australia, after being on the receiving end of some very coercive economic measures from our largest trading partner, has woken up and realized that they need to have a serious diversification strategy. And you can't have a serious diversification strategy that doesn't involve the 10th, 11th, 12th largest economy in the world, South Korea. And at the same time, South Korea has seen Australia's role in AUKUS, in the Quad, increasing a lot of other forms, and realized that they needed a much more robust strategy towards Australia. At the same time, when it was very much focused on energy transition and supply chains. And so the disruption around COVID kind of hypercharged those discussions right now. I don't have the data yet. We'll get it out relatively soon. But for the last 10 years, Australia's #1 single customer, not country, company, has been POSCO, the Pohang Iron and Steel Company. And there has been this tremendous surge in Korean investment in lithium mines, in rare earths projects, and a whole range of them that are part of this thing that is just kind of driving that synergy. So I think it's quite remarkable. Let me here just talk a little bit about something that both Korea and Australia initially viewed as a great blessing, and then have subsequently become a little bit more skeptical of. And that's the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, right? It was designed to creatively exclude China by saying that it only included countries that had a free trade agreement with the United States. Both Korea and Australia have free trade agreements with the United States. So the initial thing was celebratory. Oh, we can sell our stuff directly to the U.S. The U.S. has got this massive $800 billion investment coming to energy transition. We can get part of that. The more time has gone on, the more it's pretty clear that the Inflation Reduction Act, and this is not a surprise, was a very domestic piece of legislation designed primarily to create jobs in the United States. And so while it is good for Australia to be able to now ship critical materials more broadly, rare earths more specifically, to the United States, what it doesn't include in there are the incentive structures to get U.S. investment into Korea, into Australia, and to allow us to move up the value chain. And in fact, if anything, we're seeing this in Korea too. It's encouraging Koreans to figure out then they've got to have their investment on the ground in the United States. Korea is labor poor in terms of the population. That kind of works for them. It's really well. Australia, obviously, it's got some work to do on that front. So this is something we discussed. It's still a net good. It's just there's some things to be worked out in terms of the process. Let me just kind of wrap up, because I think I've already gone on a little bit too long, by putting a little bit of framing on this. Everybody will understand that when we start talking, the reason we're talking about critical materials and the reason we're paying attention is because there's anxiety about supply chains. And why is there anxiety about supply chains? Because the overwhelming majority of processing today is done in China. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. China's done a lot of investment. They're very, very efficient in this sector. There's actually only one commercial scale rare earths processing facility on the planet outside of China, and that's a West Australian company, Lynas, in Malaysia. And yet every day it's facing pressure and efforts to kind of get it closed down. The only reason that exists is because the Japanese funded that after the rare earth scare of 2010, where China temporarily put a quota on rare earth exports to Japan. So everybody's talking about that, but I would propose that's a good way to get the attention of hawks in all three of our countries. But there's another way to look at this, and maybe Adam will chime more in this. By any projection, the demand for lithium, for other battery materials, for critical materials more broadly and rare earths more specifically is going like this. And the production in 10 years has got to be something like 3 times what it is today. And so that means that our job is not to take things away from China. Our job is to build new networks, robust networks outside of China, and to ensure that we are not exposed to the geostrategic risks of that. And I would just conclude by saying the 3 countries represented in this report have one of the best chances of building that type of a robust network outside of China with Korean investment, Korean manufacturing, U.S. markets and U.S. investment manufacturing, and Australian raw materials, and hopefully some processing on our side. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gordon. Let's go over to Adam, who's going to talk about the development and supply of critical materials and the roles and requirements needed for trilateral cooperation.
Well, thank you, John. I think I can follow up by saying to Gordon, yes, 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 and yes. And what I want to do this morning is focus on only one metal. All of us are aware of energy critical minerals because they're in the news throughout the world. And when we think of energy critical minerals, we hear a lot about cobalt, which of course right now is embedded within our lithium-ion batteries. We hear about child labor and artisanal mining labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo and concerns about the cobalt supply chain. Lots of battery manufacturers are now reducing the amount of cobalt per battery. And what I want to focus on is the metal copper. So for me, copper is like the artery in the human body. Everything electrified requires copper. Even if we substitute some aluminum for copper, our global electricity system relies on copper, and everything that we use, all of our technologies, battery operated, plugged in, all require copper. And we hear a lot in the news about what the demand for copper will be in the future: 2 times current demand, 3 times current demand. But what I want to do is I want to show everyone who is listening and watching how much copper we will need and how much copper realistically can be provided from mining companies around the world. So what I've done here is I have plotted the total copper demand on the y-axis, and this is in millions of tons. And on the x-axis is time, calendar year. And in 2018, global demand for copper was 23.7 million tons. And that number, 23.7 million tons, is the total amount of copper that mining companies extracted from the earth and produced for us, plus all of the copper that was recycled globally. So it is truly the entire amount of copper that was made available on the shelf for companies around the world to use, including companies in Korea. There are several lines on the plot. The lowest line is labeled non-energy transition demand. And what that line communicates is the projected amount of copper that the world needs in order to satisfy the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So if we, for example, think about our world, we have a population of just now in excess of 8 billion people. About 1 billion people have no access to electricity, and another 3 to 4 billion people do not have access to electricity the way that we think of accessing electricity in Korea, Australia, the United States. So if we want the entire world to have access to clean energy, that is represented by the non-energy transition demand. And what you can see is that demand alone by 2050 requires almost 2 times the amount of annual copper production than was produced in 2018. Also shown on this graph are lines for the amount of copper that is required if we achieve the climate policy goals of the US Inflation Reduction Act and the climate policy goals of the European Union Green Energy Act. So if all of the vehicles in the United States and the European Union transition from internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, so everyone drives a battery electric vehicle, all of our deliveries are made with battery electric vehicle trucks, all of our motorcycles are battery electric vehicles, you can see that over the next several decades, the total amount of copper increases from 23.7 million tons in 2018 to more than 55 million tons required in the year 2050. And that top line is labeled wind and solar. That indicates that if all of our vehicles in the US and the European Union are battery electric, and all of that electricity is supplied by a combination of wind turbines and solar panels, that top line indicates how much copper demand there will be, and it's significant. So if we can flip to the next slide. Now I'm showing you if the entire world transitions to battery electric vehicles and all of the electricity is produced by wind and solar, that is the top line labeled W and S only. And what that shows us is if the entire world, the United States, the European Union, China, all other countries produce all of our electricity from a combination of wind turbines and solar panels, and all vehicles everywhere are battery electric vehicles, we need almost 150 million tons of copper in the year 2050 to make that happen. And you can see that year over year from 2018 through today projected into the future, we continually need more copper. Next slide, please. So what I've done with my collaborator, Larry Cathels at Cornell University, is we modeled the realistic production of copper from mines globally over the next roughly 80 years. And what we did and what is shown here are 3 sets of data. If you look at the lower left corner of the graph and you see the bold squiggly line, that bold squiggly line represents the real copper produced by mining companies around the world for the years 2000 through 2022. And what we did is we took data for the global mine production of copper from the year 1900 through 2022, and we modeled the future mine production of copper, which is shown as the solid red line labeled mine production. And what the model indicates is that in the year 2086, globally, mining companies will produce about 46 million tons of copper. The black line labeled refinery output represents the total amount of copper that is the sum of the mine production and recycled copper. And you can see that there is a peak in that production or output in 2086 of about 61.6 million tons. I'm happy to share the math behind this for people who are interested. Please send me an email. But now if we flip to the next slide, what everyone needs to have an understanding of is that when we think about the total copper demand to achieve the Inflation Reduction Act, to electrify all of our transportation, to produce all of that electricity by a combination of wind turbines and solar panels, what we think of as clean energy or green energy, renewable energy, based on historic copper production globally, we will not have enough copper to electrify the global fleet and to produce all of the electricity needed by wind and solar. We just will not have that total amount. And this has a number of really important implications. Among them, this will increase the level of competition for copper. It will likely increase the price of copper because as demand increases and supply increases at a slower rate, that historically has caused the price to increase. And that likely results in more developed countries, Australia, Korea, the United States, countries in the European Union, countries that we think of as belonging to the, quote, global north, end quote, we will be able to afford copper at a higher price. And as we electrify and we purchase copper, that reduces the potential for less developed countries. So think here about almost all countries in Africa, most countries in Latin America, many countries in Southeast Asia. They will not be able to purchase copper in order to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So one of the key things that we suggest is policymakers need to think about the climate policy goals through the lens of how much of a given metal, in this case copper, is realistically going to be available. Everyone is in agreement that we need to reduce the use of fossil fuels combined with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and we need to electrify. What this study demonstrates is electrification as it's currently embedded within the Inflation Reduction Act is not going to be possible. So we need to rethink how we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We also need to rethink our permitting process for mines in the European Union and the United States. Australia has a very strong record of opening mines and producing metals with minimal environmental impact and working with local community stakeholders, including members of Aboriginal communities. And what we suggest is that the US and the EU borrow the best practices from Australia so that we can increase metal production from mines domestically within the US as well as the EU. And John, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Let's turn now to Dr. Song. Can you talk about the importance of securing supply chains and for future energy and critical materials?
Thank you, John. As Gordon already touched upon the Korea-US-Australia trilateral partnership of complementarity and synergy, adding to that, let me start by talking to you how big trading partners of Korea these two countries are. As of last year, next slide, please. As of last year, the United States became the third largest trading partner of Korea, accounting for 13.5% of our total trade, next to China and ASEAN. And the US has become our largest foreign direct investment destination, accounting for 36% of the total. And the US share has been on a steady increase recently. In Australia is Korea's fifth largest trading partner, accounting for 4.5% of total, and the 10th largest FDI destination. And as you know, Australia also has strength in upstream in critical mineral supply chain. As Gordon already said, Cusco is the single largest foreign investor in Western Australia, for instance. So this provides a good ground for the three countries to enhance further cooperation. Next slide. So why is it important to secure critical minerals in general? Well, as already mentioned earlier, the intensifying digitalization, or the fourth industrial revolution, as we call it in this part of the world, the new industry structure requires more critical minerals. And the accelerating reorganization of global supply chains has increased the importance of critical minerals. Also, our clean energy transition endeavor highlights the growing importance of critical minerals. And yet, the critical minerals are concentrated in a small number of countries, making us vulnerable to supply oligopoly and thus easy weaponization when geopolitics matters more. Such tendency often brings about greater supply shocks, price vulnerabilities, and intensifying competition for critical minerals. So we can say we live exposed to resource nationalism risks. Next slide. And so what does that mean for a country like Korea? The current landscape has greater implications for Korea, a resource-poor country, which has a greater demand for resources, given its industrial structure, a manufacturing powerhouse, and its net zero goal. Korea imports 95% of resources it needs. So it makes Korea greatly exposed to supply shocks and vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. So against this backdrop, the Korean government announced its critical mineral strategy this past February with two overarching goals. Well, let me briefly explain about this because it's less known as compared to your IRA and the Australian policy. So it has two overarching goals. One, it is to lower import dependency on lithium, cobalt, graphite, and other critical minerals from the current 80% to 50% by 2030. And it is to expand the recycling of critical minerals from the current 2% to 20% by 2030. I saw your face, John. I know people must be thinking, boy, these people must be really ambitious. Well, I quite agree with you. But then I could say, these two overarching goals could be good indicative guidelines, constantly reminding us of the way forward that we must be heading to. Next slide. And this critical mineral strategy has 7 specific plans that include identifying critical minerals. And for this year, the Korean government has identified 33 critical minerals, which are subject to annual review and change. For comparison, the United States has identified 50 critical minerals, Australia 26, the EU 30, and China 37. And it's aiming at strengthening crisis response capacity, such as the global critical mineral mapping and early warning system. And it is also under this scheme, the stockpile of critical minerals will be made to suffice for 100 days from the previous 54 days. And it is to promote high-level diplomacy with resource-rich countries like Australia, the United States, which are already our good friends and an ally, of course. And we want to support the Korean companies to find more opportunities for collaboration with foreign companies and in international projects. And plans include a strengthening support role of public institutions. For example, these relevant public institutions can conduct preliminary explorations on high-risk projects, demanding high level of expertise. And it can also conduct preliminary project feasibility analysis. Next slide. The plans include providing financial assistance for critical mineral investment by in the form of loans and insurance for the opening of local mining subsidiaries. And if a mining project fails, the burden of tax on dividends will be reduced by extending the scope of deductible expenses. The plans also include creating a cycle of system for waste resources into reusable materials for EV batteries and secondary batteries. And finally, it includes building a legal structure and strengthening the development of sustainable smelting technology in consideration of ESG standards. I know these are very difficult to do, very tough, but as I said, you can take them as indicative guidelines. Next slide. So technology, given all this, technology development, new technology development is critical for Korea, especially in upgrading, refining, and recycling for reuse, and developing alternatives to critical minerals, and in exploration, extraction, and processing. So for the above, I think sustained financial assistance is very important. So without, sustained financial assistance, I think it's a non-starter. Next slide. So having said all that, what do we need to do together? Well, ensuring the resilience of critical mineral supply chains is no single country's job. So international collaboration and partnerships are essential, such as mineral security partnerships and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, supply chain agreements, free trade agreements, and so on and so forth. And also, I think we need to promote more joint academic and on-site training programs where promising young people from not just these three countries, but other countries in the Indo-Pacific and the global South in particular can participate. We can think of trilateral or Indo-Pacific scholarships, something like a Fulbright scholarship in the fields of critical minerals and clean energy transition, which can draw more attention from young people. So, but then what's most important is action. We need to show our commitment to action via funding and pulling resources together. It could be national funding like the Overseas Development Assistance, or global partnership like the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, and certainly the multilateral development banks. As you know, the G20 leaders just this month in New Delhi agreed to replenish MDB's funds, and I hope they will deliver their commitments. And the private sector, of course, essential. Next slide, please. So I would also like to propose that these three countries establish a trilateral R&D center, and it be housed in Seoul, Korea. I think it's a good candidate because Korea is a resourceful country with heavy use of critical minerals and with strong technology capacity. And we have human resources, plenty of graduates of material science, mining, metallurgy, chemical engineering. And we also offer an affordable cost of living, as compared to the United States and Australia. And so I think this joint R&D center should be funded by both government and the private sector, making a genuine international public-private partnership project. And this joint R&D center can start as a trilateral initiative and later evolve into an Indo-Pacific R&D center in alignment with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement concerning supply chain resilience, provided the IPAC survives. And I'm just showing you next slide, two of my monthly op-eds on this very issue in Korea after our seminar in Seoul. One for a Korean language daily, and the other, next one please, for an English language daily. And next slide. Lastly, on the bilateral front, actually, even before our discussion in June in Seoul, I've been arguing and advocating for the establishment of Korea's diplomatic mission in Perth, Australia. Well, I don't think I need to explain why, because Gordon already elaborated on that point. And I'm very glad Gordon is with me on this point. And so I'm hoping our ideas will be translated into action soon enough to meet the demands of critical minerals globally. With this, I conclude my very short presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Kyung-Jin. This was, all three of you gave excellent remarks. Let's go to the Q&A box. And right now, as we wait for people to develop some questions, let me pose a question to Adam. When you talked about the need, I mean, if we were to fully electrify the world as we're electrified in Korea, Australia, and the United States and elsewhere, 150 million tons of copper is going to be needed by 2050, as opposed to the 23 million tons that are mined now. But if you remember, when we talked back in Seoul, we also talked about the need to improve the regulatory process, the licensing and regulations and things like that. And if you look at it for a place like China, with you illustrated with a mine in Indonesia, the Chinese were able to get the license within a 12-month period, where I believe you said the average time to get it to have a license in places like the United States and Australia could be 15, 16 years. How do you square this need to have to be able to reach this peak, right? And this need, and with the regulatory process that currently exists? I mean, and also, how do you still ensure some type of environmental protections as well?
John, I think when we think of mines, they operate on very different timelines than anything else we can imagine building. In Australia and Canada, which I think are the two countries that do the best job at regulating mining and permitting mining, it takes on average at least 10 years from the time a company says, we want to open a new mine in West Australia, or we want to open a new mine in British Columbia. It's at least 10 years before they physically have the mine infrastructure built and they can make available the metal that they want, copper, gold, silver, whatever it may be. A lot of times we look at how we build infrastructure, such as houses. We think about building battery manufacturing facilities, and we see those literally get built before our eyes in months to at most 1 to 2 years. Mines require a significant amount of capital. So if a company wants to do exploration for copper in Western Australia, from the time they say, yes, let's send our geologist out there, let's look for a new deposit, we find a new deposit, we build the infrastructure, they're looking at $1 billion minimum and at least a decade. So we know right now that globally, the metals, we can think of them as the metals in the pipeline based on mining companies that have announced major projects around the world. And for the metal copper, there are only 2 major copper mines that have been developed in the last 30 years. That's it. So if we think about the metals that we need, and we look, for example, at the top 10 producing copper mines on the planet, in order to produce the copper to satisfy the Inflation Reduction Act, we need to open, on average, one of the world's biggest mines every year for the next 25 years. And it's just not possible. China has been successful at opening mines in, as you mentioned, Indonesia, faster than anyone in human history. If we look at some of the Chinese owned and operated nickel mines in Indonesia, they've been able to open those on timeframes of 12 to 18 months. There are concerns about the environmental and ecologic impacts of opening those mines so rapidly. The mines in Indonesia you can think of as akin to strip mines. And so they have the potential to do a lot of irreversible damage to the ecosystem because you're clearing the landscape in order to then mine the metals that are beneath the soil profile. There are concerns about the waste and the wastewater from those mining operations. And so I think that's also where policymakers in the US really need to take a look at how we mine, how permitting can be done rapidly in places such as Australia. And the US really needs to take a look at how policymakers can encourage big banks and hedge funds and other entities with a lot of capital to put that capital into finding and building new mines.
Thank you.
Can I, before we go to the questions,
sure. Go ahead.
If you took nothing away from the first 3 presentations, particularly from Adam's excellent remarks, it's that the energy transition fundamentally goes hand in hand with mining. And there's an issue here in Australia on the East Coast, and there's an issue in the United States on the East Coast of the United States, is that the public opinion tends to conflate mining and energy. Because mining in the East Coast of the United States is synonymous with coal. Mining in the East Coast of Australia is synonymous with coal. And so mining often kind of gets grouped together with this. And there's this assumption somehow that we're going to have this carbon-free economy without mining. And Adam just gave us one mineral, right? There's just so many others in terms of that process. And so I think, again, this obviously is a very biased statement coming out of a mining state like WA, but mining is the future. I'm a little bit more optimistic about changes of paces. I mean, governments are always slow until they have to move. And so we're seeing right now, in the space of 2 years, things in the defense sector on AUKUS that would be unimaginable 2 years ago in terms of pace of change. And my guess is that we're going to see an awful lot on that front as well. And hopefully, obviously, maintain the same kind of standards, just to speed it up process. But we'll see.
Yeah, and John, just one quick comment to follow up. It's also important when we think about mining that it has, I would say, almost the singular potential for providing for socioeconomic improvement in the developing world, right? So when we think about artisanal mining in a place, for example, such as the Congo, the reason that humans are engaged in artisanal mining is that is their economic livelihood. There's no unemployment in the Congo. There's no national health service in the Congo. And so the people that are mining there are in many ways similar to the artisanal miners that colonized Western Australia, the artisanal miners that colonized the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the middle of the 19th century. So I think there also needs to be thought given to the economic importance of mining in the less developed world, and the role that it will play in providing capital for development.
Thank you. Let's move. During the course of your responses, we've have a number of questions. And so why don't we go to the first one from Lalana De Silva. China imports much of its critical materials from countries where the supply chains are replete with labor, human rights, and environmental abuses. As a tripartite country partnership invests in new supply chains, these are issues that will need to be addressed to ensure the chain is socially and environmentally acceptable. This will require investments which will drive the price of critical materials from these new, clean, and sustainable supply chains higher than those of China. Is that a consequence that's been considered? Will this reduce the competitiveness of the new critical materials? Would the speakers please comment on the commitment of the tripartite countries to safeguard the environment, labor, and human rights in the critical materials investments they make? Who would like to?
Let me start on that, and others can kind of add to that. I am wary of the kind of black and white narrative that the critical materials processing pipeline in China is corrupt, destroys the environment, and is full of slave labor, because all of those do exist. But at the same time, most of the Chinese plants have the remarkable technology. They have honed and built that technology, and they put an awful lot of investment into it, and they're world class in terms of their own beating. And so I think we need to be a little bit careful about going down the path of China bad, the rest of the world good. The real concern for countries like Korea, the United States, and Australia is the worry that China maintains the ability to cut off the pipeline in times of crisis, right? And so there is obviously concerns, as Lana laid out, about increased prices, but in any pricing, you need to factor in risk. There's a risk premium, and you can get things really, really cheap. But then if you don't factor in a risk premium, then you can lose it. So we in Australia, over the course of 30 years, whether it's our crayfish or our barley or wine or the things, shipped it to China, and China offered top dollars. And so we abandoned long-standing 30-year relationships with Japan and Korea just to get a little bit of dollar. Then all of a sudden, China turned on a dime and cut those off. People hadn't paid the risk premium, right? They got a little bit more, but then we're exposed to that risk. So the last thing I'll say on this is processing, right? So for every one of the critical materials, there is a complex, processing supply chain, from how it comes from out of the ground in a place like Chile or Australia, and how it ends up in a phone or a car battery in Korea or Japan, right? And where China has the chokehold right now is not in the mining, nor in, again, they're doing pretty good on the production side of things, right? But that's not a chokehold, right? It's demand on their side. It's really in that midstream processing, and every critical material, you can go through the full spectrum of them, both rare earths and critical materials more broadly, has a different level of steps. And so one of the objectives we ought to have in the short term is how do we to get as much of that outside of China as possible? Because the complexity of it is, if you get, out of 7 stages, and you get, the final 2 stages done in Korea, and you get the first 4 stages done in Australia, but that 5th stage is still in China, you're still just as vulnerable. So it's just about building this robust network of options, not taking it away from China, but building a new robust, network outside of that. I'll just give you one specific example that's really thriving here right now. Albemarle, U.S. chemical company, major mining company, has a major mining investment here in Western Australia. They mine from the same mine as Chenqi Lithium, which is a Chinese company. Albemarle decades ago gave their technology to the Chinese. The Chinese have improved it, and now they're importing it back here with the intent of producing lithium hydroxide, which can be exported directly to Korea and Japan rather than sent off to China for processing. So that just gives you one example of what you want to be doing is making sure that you've got supply chains that are sufficiently robust external to China.
Adam or Kyungjin, do you want to, Kyungjin, please?
Adam, would you like to go first?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, to the same question, in terms of price competitiveness, no one at this moment can beat China. That's why I think investment in developing new technologies is very important. Co-investment in developing new technologies is very important, and that's why I gave this proposal that 3 countries, perhaps with some other like-minded countries, to put money together and build a joint R&D center to develop new technologies, to develop alternatives to critical minerals, and to develop climate technologies, etc. And if we can get ahead with new technologies and more effective technologies, I think the problems arising from the so-called ESG, economic, social, governance, the labor, environment, human rights issues can be reduced, I believe. So I would really like to support and push forward this joint R&D center proposal.
Yeah, and John, I'll just follow up there and say I totally agree that a joint R&D center is needed. One of the things that we can't predict is what technologies will we develop over the next decade. And for me, I use the example of my 17-year-old son who's doing research with a battery engineering group here at the University of Michigan. They're working on batteries that eliminate the need for lithium. They eliminate the need for cobalt. And so within the next 5 to 10 years, we can anticipate completely new battery technologies that change our dependence on some of these metals. For example, CATL in China has now prototyped a new battery electric vehicle, and the battery is a sodium battery. So it requires 0 cobalt, 0 nickel, 0 manganese. It still requires copper, but that is a game changer for the demand for specific metals. And I think that's where this trilateral can have a significant positive impact by promoting research, collaborative research among the 3 of our countries, so that we can take the best and brightest students in universities and their faculty and have them develop new battery technologies, new renewable energy technologies. For example, there is now a company spun out of one of the US Department of Energy labs that is producing wind turbines that do not need permanent magnets. If you eliminate permanent magnets from wind turbines, that eliminates the need for heavy rare earth elements. And China mines 56% of heavy rare earth elements and produces 100% of the downstream product. So, this is where I tell most of the young people I engage with, I'm extremely optimistic because technology is being developed at such a rapid pace, and it is likely going to significantly decrease our need for some of these metals moving forward.
Thank you. Our next question is from Jillian Myers. I think, Gordon, this is pretty much addressed to you. Is the changing Australia-China relationship impacting businesses on the ground operations in Australia? And if so, how?
Not as much as you might think, just because the primary source of demand for the core commodities that Australia continues to produce, like iron ore, which is so big. And so over the course of the last decade, our little institutional mantra was diversify, diversify, diversify. And during the first 8 years of that, we got no traction whatsoever. In fact, our relative dependence on China just continued to go up. And that's just because of the opportunity. As I mentioned in my previous remarks, being on the receiving end of some very politically motivated economic coercion has now changed public opinion, but there's not a lot of other options out there, right? And so there's no other economy that can take the same percentage of iron ore as China does. And so if we ever lose China as a market for iron ore, plan B is to leave it in the ground, right? That's it in terms of that. And in fact, for all of the things we're talking about, this is one of these really interesting challenges. On the one hand, we need China to continue to grow and innovate themselves and to provide on a cost-efficient basis the materials necessary to lead to an energy transition. At the same time, we want to be careful not to be dependent on it. And there's that fundamental tension in that regard. But what you've seen change in Australia is public opinion. 5 years ago, 86% of Australians viewed China as primarily an opportunity, and now 86% view it as primarily a threat. And that actually matches very closely the numbers in South Korea, right? Actually, probably in both those cases, more than the United States. And I think that's just because of our relative exposure to China and our relative size. Remember, there are 5 million more Texans than there are Aussies in the world.
Our next question. Oh, did anyone else have anything to add? Kyung-Jin, please.
It may not be directly related to the question itself, but let me just emphasize this point. We should never forget that there are less well-to-do countries. Let us not forget the global south. BRICS just expanded into what, 11 members, right? They claim to represent the global south. Why? The direct reason cause was that the global south was excluded from the vaccine facilities during the COVID. And I think in our critical mineral access processing, the global south countries should not be excluded either. Otherwise, G7, G20 will be less relevant and we will lose our friends.
Our next question comes from Andrei Barannik. He's asking, how do environmental and social safeguards processes, how will they be strengthened to avoid environmental damage, GHG emissions, and avoid corruption in host countries, particularly, I guess, in Africa? Adam, would you like to answer that first?
Yeah, I spent a significant amount of time last month in the Democratic Republic of Congo, visiting both industrial copper cobalt mines and artisanal copper cobalt mines, small scale mining operations. And it's a big challenge. What we're seeing in countries such as the DRC is artisanal mining is really the only way to meet rapidly growing demand. And this allows for the growth of graft and corruption at every step of that artisanal supply chain, ultimately until it leaves the DRC and crosses the border into Zambia and then South Africa, where it's shipped to China for processing. I do see some positive effort on the part of the embassy in Kinshasa and the State Department, but it's not enough. I think we need more meaningful engagement with the government in the DRC so that we can truly partner and work with them to help them understand how they can transition the current state of artisanal mining to an artisanal mining process that does not negatively impact both humans and the environment. Right now we're sort of operating on a model of we tell you what to do, but we really need to work with them and show them how it can be done.
Would anyone else wish to add anything? Gordon?
Just very briefly, Marcus Noland, an economist at the Peterson Institute for International Affairs, did a book probably 6 or 7 years ago called The Resource Curse. and it's really the common law inheritance of Australia, Canada, the United States that enabled us to deal with riches, natural resources without the normal corrupting impact that comes along with that. And few other economies have done that. Japan and Korea are both natural resource poor, right? And so they've had a different approach to that going forward. So I couldn't agree with Adam more. We've got to go forward. And I would actually indicate here, I'm coming across sounding like a real dove on this, but this is a key area where we actually have to work with China on this. I mean, if you look at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which Korea joined, Australia joined, there was a lot of resistance around it. A decade later, not quite a decade later, I would like to insist that all of China's Belt Road stuff goes through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank because of European and Australian and Korean involvement, there's levels of standards. And so we should not abandon our hard-fought standards and principles, transparency, non-corruptive, in respect for environment and anti-slavery, those kind of things. The liberal part of the liberal rules-based order, in engaging with other countries. And the risk is that in a headlong rush to get more copper or other critical materials, that we're going to let those guys go by the wayside. And I think we're in a much stronger position if we don't do that. So.
Yeah,
Yes.
I agree with Gordon on AIIB. From day one, the U.S. should have joined the AIIB and improve their internal governance structure. I hope the U.S. will join the AIIB as soon as possible. So will Japan.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, but I have one based from our conversation back in Seoul, and it was brought up here talking about the importance of exchanges and educational opportunity of critical materials. I remember when we were talking about, mining, the average person will think of mining as like dirty work, right? And so how do we get people? Do we have people with the skills in, respective labor forces in all three countries to be able to engage in this type of development of critical materials over the next several decades? So Adam, I'll go with you, and then Gordon, and then Kyungjin.
Yeah, really quickly. We know from a survey that McKinsey and Company did last year that if you rank the top 10 industries globally for the perception of future careers among people 18 to 29, mining of metals ranks at the bottom, below oil and natural gas. I think what we need people, for example, here in Washington, who come out and advocate for responsible mining. When you visit mines today, as Gordon suggested, they're not the mines of the 1700s and 1800s. The mines today are as clean as possible. The safety standards and the environmental standards are absolutely impeccable. And we need people who are making policy and advocating for this green energy transition to also come out and advocate strongly for responsible mining in the same way that they're advocating for electrification. So if we could see, for example, President Biden, who visited my state of Michigan yesterday and was on the picket lines with people in the United Auto Workers who are striking, if we could see that level of support for mining, I think that would slowly start to change the perception of the general public, and especially young people who we desperately need to go into the mining industry, because they're the ones who will ideate and implement and create positive change.
Thank you.
It gives me hope to have someone like Adam educating the next generation on these issues, because I couldn't agree more. And I do think it is actually incumbent upon the energy transition, green energy community to actually understand the connection, that Adam made so clearly in his report, right? You need these things to happen, and again, it may change, and the things that, the new technologies may come along, but in any scenario, we've got to do it and do it better and do it cleaner. I grew up around mines in Arizona. It's the copper state of that's our big copper star right in the middle of the flag. And so I was never impressed by the big trucks and the big tires. In fact, my primary school playground was just a bunch of tires just thrown in the dirt for us kids to climb on. That was considered to be playground equipment. But if you come to Western Australia, and you look at the iron ores, you might think this is your grandfather's industry. You know, find some rocks, dig them up, crush them up, send them off. You know, but to do that at $40 a metric ton freight on board, 1,000 miles inland, it is so high tech. So I had in the course of a month, I had a chance to visit Mission Control in Johnson Space Center in Houston, while they were managing the International Space Station, and the Rio Tinto Remote Operations Center. And the Rio Tinto Remote Operations Center was by orders of magnitude more high tech. Everything is done, you have remote control trains, remote control drivers, all AI driven trucks and the like, just because you might as well be on the moon. If you're 2,000 kilometers away from here, out in the middle of this really, really, really difficult environment, you've got to do it. So I couldn't agree more that we do need to have, last thing I'll say on that is we will still get here, our Minister for Resources here would get flack politically for taking politicians to go visit mine sites, because it's that dirty old industry. And I'm like, what are you thinking? we need this, for the energy transition. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, just for 1 minute. When our leaders meet, they produce a joint statement, and in such joint statements, they always make sure to include something about STEM exchange programs, STEM scholarships. So from now on, and also these days, all the leaders talk about the importance of critical minerals. So we must make sure our leaders talk about critical minerals and fostering next generation leaders in that mining area through exchange programs and scholarships. If we can make that statement in the joint statement of our leaders, well, things will change.
This reminds me, I have a friend who works for an association, sort of like, it's not the exact name, the National Concrete Association, but it deals with the making of concrete and, involved in it. It's not just about a cement mixer and then, putting it out there, but they have established 6 programs in 6 different colleges and universities around the country to try to do this. And supposedly the average starting job for someone who goes through this training after 4 years is something like $105,000, which is a very good salary for someone who's just starting out in the world in their early to mid 20s. It sounds like this would be something that if you had an association or associations in all 3 countries, coupled with universities, government, and other companies that benefit from the mining of these critical materials, to be able to promote something like this and training and support for scholarships to get the best minds to do this. This would be an effective way to secure a talented labor force in all countries involved. This has been a very rich discussion, and I want to thank the 3 of you for your remarks, and I want to thank the audience for their questions. Again, I want to thank the Perth U.S. Asia Center, and especially you, Gordon, for helping to make all of this happen, as well as the Australia Korea Foundation and the Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as Friends of the Asia Foundation in Korea for their financial support. And finally, let me thank Vanessa Crawford, who our International Relations Program Officer in Washington, who has provided all the technology and the logistics in helping to organize today's webinar, as well as for her assistance for helping to organize the workshop in Seoul. And our colleagues in Seoul, Ms. Kyun-Suk Lee, who is the Asia Foundation's Korea Country Representative, as well as Ms. Kyun-Sung Lee, who is a Program Officer in Seoul. So I want to thank all of them for their effort in making, helping to produce this report and this webinar today. So with that, our meeting is adjourned. Again, thank you for an excellent discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good day. All the best.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, and congratulations on the report. Well done.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.